Out here, where the sky meets the scorched earth, land isn't just owned, it's bled for. And when Martha Cartwright's land, the only thing left of her murdered husband, was being choked out by greed, well, most folks just turned away. They saw a lone widow, frail against the coming storm stirred up by Hiram Blackwood and his ruthless sons. They saw an easy victim. What they didn't see was the steel buried deep beneath the grief, or the silent watcher already perched on the ridge line, carrying a justice older than any land deed, older than the town itself. This wasn't just a story about stolen earth. It was about a debt repaid in thunder, and a truth brought home on the tip of a Lakota warrior's lance. Stick around, and hear how vengeance rode into Redemption Creek. Martha Cartwright felt the weight of the valley's eyes whenever she rode into town. Pity mostly. Sometimes fear. 6 months. It had been 6 months since Thomas was gone, taken by a so-called riding accident during the spring cattle drive. An accident nobody quite believed, not really, especially when Hyram Blackwood benefited most. Thomas had loved this plot of land, tucked into a fertile bend of Cottonwood Creek. He'd seen a lifetime here, coaxed life from the stubborn soil with his own calloused hands. Now Martha tended that life alone, the silence of the small cabin amplifying her grief. Her world had shrunk to the rhythms of survival. Dawn meant checking the few chickens scratching in the dust, their numbers dwindling. Then the vegetable garden, her main defense against hunger, demanding constant weeding and watering from the barrel that collected precious rain. Fences needed mending, fences that seemed to break with unnatural frequency near the Blackwood property line. It was hard, unending work under a sun that baked the hope right out of you. But the physical labor was almost a comfort compared to the gnawing unease that crept in with the dusk. Redemption Creek wasn't a haven. It was Blackwood territory. Hyram Blackwood's bar, ranch sprawled across the valley floor, swallowing smaller holdings one by one. His ambition was a tangible thing, thick and suffocating like summer dust. Men tipped their hats to him, but their smiles were thin, their eyes averted. In the mercantile, conversations would halt mid-sentence when his shadow fell across the doorway. Old Man Hemlock behind the counter would suddenly find something urgent to rearrange under the counter. Fear had deeper roots here than cottonwood trees. Martha saw it all. Grief hadn't blinded her. If anything, it had sharpened her senses. She moved through her chores with quiet efficiency, but her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, noting the dust plumes of riders, the subtle shifts in the landscape. Sometimes, while kneading dough or patching Thomas's old shirt, her fingers would unconsciously trace the faint, silvery lines on her left wrist, hidden beneath her sleeve. Scars from another life, a harder life, one that had taught her more than planting beans and darning socks. She knew the heft and balance of the Winchester rifle above the mantelpiece, not just as a tool against predators, but as an extension of her own will. She could read the ground like a book. Faint tracks, disturbed stones, the passage of unseen things. She saw Blackwood's riders trespass with impunity, saw the fear bloom in her neighbor's eyes, felt the slow strangulation of the valley spirit. Her quiet life wasn't peaceful. It was a tense, watchful pause, the deep breath before the plunge. The Blackwoods thought her broken. They were dangerously mistaken. It wasn't a matter of if they'd make a direct move for her land, only when, and how ugly it would get. The first move came wrapped in false sympathy. Hyram Blackwood arrived one blistering afternoon, the sun glinting off the silver conchos on his saddle. His sons, Gus and Caleb, positioned themselves like grim bookends, their presence alone a form of intimidation. Gus, lean and mean-eyed, smirked openly. Caleb, hulking and silent, simply stared, his gaze flat and hostile. Hiram swung down, his boots kicking up puffs of the fine red dust that coated everything. He removed his expensive felt hat, revealing a damp, balding scalp, but his eyes were dry and hard as agate. "Martha," he began, his voice attempting a neighborly tone that didn't quite mask the gravel beneath it. A terrible thing about Thomas. A real loss to the valley. Strong back, good worker. He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze sweeping over her small, neat cabin, the struggling garden, the patched fences. "This is hard country, Martha. Especially hard for a woman on her own. Too much land, maybe. Too much work. Martha stood on the small porch, her hands clenched at her sides. The worn wood felt solid beneath her feet, the only solid thing in that moment. I manage, Mr. Blackwood. Her voice was low, steady. Hiram gave a short, barking laugh. Manage? Child, you're barely holding on. This creek-bottom land, it needs a firm hand. Needs development. Progress. My operation, well, it requires room to grow. This little patch, it interrupts the flow, you understand. Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice near the porch steps. Yeah, Pa means your little dirt farm is in the way. An eyesore blocking the Barbie's view. Caleb shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking ominously. Hiram shot his son a look, more annoyed than truly corrective. Manners, Gus. We're here to help Mrs. Cartwright. He turned back to Martha, his smile thin as a razor cut. Look, out of respect for Thomas, and because I'm a generous man, I'll make you an offer. Cash money. Enough to get you back east, someplace civilized. Find yourself a comfortable situation. He named a figure that was barely enough to cover the cost of the lumber in her cabin, let alone the land itself. It was a blatant insult disguised as charity. Martha felt a coldness spread through her chest, pushing back the fear. Her chin came up. Thank you for your offer, Mr. Blackwood, but this land is not for sale. Thomas put his heart into this place. It's my home now. I intend to keep it. The false geniality vanished from Hiram's face like mist in the morning sun. His eyes narrowed. Don't be stubborn, Martha. Sentiment won't protect you when the winter winds blow, or when other misfortunes strike. Accidents happen out here. Lonely place. Gus grinned, showing stained teeth. Real lonely. Snakes in the woodpile. Lamps get knocked over. Fences just fall down. Easy for cattle to wander then. He kicked at the dirt near her feet, a gesture of pure contempt. Hiram settled his hat back on his head, the finality clear in his posture. Think on it, Martha. The offer's on the table. For now. Don't make me withdraw it. He swung back onto his horse, his sons following suit. They wheeled their mounts sharply, deliberately showering her porch in dust, a parting gesture of dominance. Martha watched them ride away, the silence they left behind ringing with the echo of their threats. Her grip tightened on the porch rail until her knuckles were white. The first shot had been fired. The question now was how she would answer. The answer came not in words, but in wire cutters. The very next morning, she found the northern fence line, the one bordering Blackwood's sprawling range, snipped clean in multiple places. Not frayed by weather, not broken by a panicked steer. Cut. Deliberately. Precisely. It was a message, cold and clear. The harassment had begun. It continued, a relentless campaign designed to grind her down. A few days later, a dozen Barbie steers wandered through the conveniently cut fence. They trampled her bean patch flat, devoured half her corn stalks, and churned the earth around her precious water barrel into muddy soup. It took her the entire sweltering afternoon to drive them back out, her voice hoarse from shouting, her arms aching from waving a stick. Then, hours more spent painstakingly repairing the fence, her hands scraped raw by the sharp wire, knowing it was likely futile. Next, the well. She went to draw water one morning, her bucket scraping uselessly against the stone lining. Looking down, she saw the frayed end of the rope floating on the surface. Cut again. Retrieving it was an exercise in frustration, lowering herself precariously into the darkness, using a grappling hook fashioned from wire and a broken rake handle. By the time she fixed it, hauling the heavy, waterlogged rope back up, her shoulders burned, and precious daylight was lost. The act felt particularly cruel, striking at her most basic need. Supplies ordered from Redemption Creek started disappearing. A sack of flour, a side of bacon, lamp oil, vanished between the store and her homestead. Old Man Hemlock would just shrug, avoiding her gaze, muttering about rough roads and unreliable freight drivers. But Martha knew. She saw the smirks on the faces of Blackwood's men when they rode past her, saw the extra provisions, sometimes tied behind their saddles. Sheriff Brody offered sympathy, but little else. Brody listened in his dusty office, swirling the dregs of cold coffee in his cup, his face etched with weariness. Martha, he sighed. after she calmly listed the incidents. "I believe you. Every word. But Hyram Blackwood, he's got deep pockets and long arms in this valley. His men are loyal to his coin, not the law. Without proof, hard proof, witnesses willing to stand up." He spread his hands helplessly. "Folks are scared, Martha. Scared of losing what little they have. My advice? Be careful. Maybe reconsider his offer. It might be the safer path." Safety. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She thanked the sheriff for his time, the cold resolve inside her solidifying. There was no help coming from the town. The law was a distant rumor here. She was utterly alone in this fight. But alone didn't mean helpless. Each act of sabotage chipped away at her hope but fueled a different fire within her, a cold, calculating anger. She became even more observant, from the cover of her cabin window, or pretending to work near the creek bed. She tracked the patrols of Blackwood's riders. She learned their routines, their paths, the way Caleb always rode slightly behind Gus, the nervous habit one of the hands had of constantly adjusting his hat. They rode with an arrogance born of impunity, believing her too weak or too grief-stricken to notice. They didn't see the way her eyes narrowed, cataloging details, assessing their carelessness. They didn't know that every evening, after a sparse meal, she didn't just rest. Under the flickering yellow light of her oil lamp, she would take down Thomas's Winchester. Methodically, she'd disassemble it, clean each component with practiced, economical movements, oiling the smooth metal until it gleamed faintly. The familiar weight, the precise click of the mechanism as she reassembled it. It was more than maintenance. It was a centering ritual, a connection to a past where survival had demanded readiness, not submission. A coldness she recognized, a state of heightened awareness honed long ago, settled over her. The Blackwoods thought they were applying pressure. They didn't realize they were sharpening steel. They saw a widow weeping. They failed to see the strategist calculating angles, the survivor preparing her defense. The air grew thick with anticipation. The next move would be theirs, but the response would be hers. The summer heat intensified, sucking the moisture from the land, turning the usually reliable Cottonwood Creek into a sluggish trickle. Then, even the trickle vanished. Overnight, a crude but brutally effective dam of rocks and timbers appeared upstream, squarely on Blackwood land. Martha walked the dry, cracked creek bed below it, the silence of the missing water a deafening testament to Blackwood's cruelty. Her small garden, her only reliable food source besides the chickens, began to visibly wilt within hours. The leaves curled, turned brown at the edges. Her single milk cow, already thin, stood listlessly by the empty trough, its breathing shallow. Thirst was a slow, agonizing weapon, and Blackwood wielded it without hesitation. Despair threatened to overwhelm her. Standing there, staring at the dusty stones where water should have flowed, she felt a profound sense of violation. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about life itself. But before she could even begin to contemplate a response, the ground began to tremble. A low rumble grew into a thunderous roar. Looking west, towards the vast Blackwood Range, she saw a terrifying sight. Hundreds upon hundreds of cattle, a massive brown river of beef and horns, being driven hard, directly towards her property. Flanking the herd were Blackwood riders, yipping and cracking whips, pushing the terrified animals forward. Gus and Caleb were at the forefront, their faces set in grim determination. The already weakened fences exploded outwards as the panicked herd surged through, a tide of hooves and dust. They pounded across her land, obliterating the last remnants of her garden, churning the dry earth around her cabin into a desolate wasteland. The noise was deafening, the destruction absolute. When the last of the cattle had thundered past, leaving a choking cloud of dust hanging in the still air, Gus and Caleb rode back, reining in their horses sharply near her porch. They surveyed the devastation with undisguised, ugly satisfaction. "Looks like your creek ain't the only thing that's run dry, Widow Cartwright," Gus drawled, hooking a thumb in his belt. "Maybe now you'll see sense." Caleb added his piece, his voice flat. "Pa says his offer's still good, though the land ain't worth much now. Better take it before he changes his mind." Just then, Hyram Blackwood himself rode up, putting on a show of mild surprise. "Well now, what's all this? Cattle get spooked?" Boys, you gotta watch them closer. He shook his head, directing a look of false pity at Martha. See, Martha? Like I told you, it's too much. Too unpredictable out here for a woman alone. He paused, letting her absorb the ruin surrounding her. Tell you what, though, given the circumstances, I'm still willing to take this mess off your hands. Price adjusted for damages, of course. Call it neighborly concern. Something inside Martha snapped. The fear, the despair, it coalesced into pure, unadulterated rage. She stepped out of the cabin, the Winchester held firmly at her side, muzzle down but ready. Her face was streaked with dust and sweat, her eyes blazing in the harsh sunlight. Get off my land, Hiram. Her voice was low, dangerously quiet, vibrating with intensity. All of you. Get off. Now. Hiram's feigned concern evaporated. His face hardened into malice. You are making a grave mistake, woman. A mistake you'll live to regret. Or maybe you won't live that long. He spat on the ground, then wheeled his horse violently, digging in his spurs. Gus and Caleb shot her venomous glares before following their father, leaving Martha standing utterly alone amidst the wreckage, the dust settling like a shroud over her ruined hopes. That night was a blur of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Sleep was impossible. She sat in the darkened cabin, slumped in a chair near the window, the heavy Winchester resting across her lap. The silence outside was profound, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind and the occasional, distressed lowing of her thirsty cow. Sometime near dawn, drifting in a state between waking and sleep, a flicker of unnatural orange caught her eye. It danced against the weathered wood of the small barn, where she kept her meager tools and the last of Thomas's hay. Fire. Adrenaline surged through her like lightning. She scrambled out the door, grabbing the emergency bucket of water she'd kept filled from the dwindling rainwater barrel. Racing across the trampled yard, she saw flames licking greedily at the barn's dry foundation timbers. She flung the bucket's contents onto the blaze, rewarded with a hiss of steam, but the fire only momentarily faltered. Coughing against the thick, acrid smoke, she grabbed an old burlap sack and began beating frantically at the remaining flames, the heat scorching her face, embers stinging her arms. It felt like an eternity, but finally, the last embers died, leaving charred wood and the sickening smell of smoke hanging heavy in the pre-dawn air. She sank to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands blistered, her lungs aching. Staring at the blackened timbers, the sheer, relentless cruelty of the Blackwoods hit her with crushing force. They wouldn't just starve her out, they would burn her out, leave her with absolutely nothing. Tears, hot and stinging, finally tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. Was this it? Was this the end of her fight? Alone, exhausted, facing an enemy who would stop at nothing. The vast, indifferent prairie stretched out around her, offering no solace, only emptiness. The first pale light of dawn seemed not a promise, but a threat of another day of suffering. The days that followed were brittle, lived under the shadow of imminent destruction. The creek remained a mocking scar of dry earth. Martha measured out the last of the rainwater with painful care, sharing it with a suffering cow, whose ribs were now starkly visible. Hope felt like a forgotten language. She moved like an automaton, patching the barn as best she could, scavenging for edible weeds the cattle hadn't destroyed. One stifling afternoon, driven by thirst and a desperate need to find even a damp patch of mud near the vanished creek, her worn boot heel struck something hard, half buried in the baked clay. Thinking it just another rock, she bent to pry it loose, but stopped. It wasn't stone. It was dark, volcanic glass, obsidian. An arrowhead. She picked it up, rubbing the dust away. It was unlike the flint points used by the local tribes she occasionally traded with. This was sleeker, intricately notched with geometric patterns she vaguely recognized. Lakota. Why was it here, so far south of their usual territory? A ripple of unease went through her, a feeling that this small object held some unknown significance. She slipped it into her apron pocket, the cool weight a strange comfort against her hip. Later that day, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, casting long, skeletal shadows, she saw movement. 3 riders. Not Gus or Caleb this time, but rougher men, hired hands from the Blackwood ranch, faces hardened by wind and whiskey. They weren't driving cattle or checking fences. They rode directly towards her cabin, their purpose radiating menace. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, her knuckles white. The Winchester was just inside, leaning against the wall, loaded. But before the riders could cross onto her property, another figure emerged, appearing as if from the very rock and air on the ridge opposite her cabin. A lone horseman, silhouetted sharply against the dying light. Even at this distance, the outline was unmistakable. A Native American warrior, poised and still upon a pinto pony. Buckskins, a scattering of feathers in his dark hair, a long lance held upright beside him, its tip catching the last rays of the sun. He didn't move, didn't shift. He simply sat, an embodiment of watchful stillness, radiating an aura of calm, undeniable power. The Blackwood riders saw him too. They hauled their horses to a sudden stop, their confident approach dissolving into nervous uncertainty. They exchanged uneasy glances, muttering amongst themselves, casting furtive looks up at the silent figure on the ridge. The warrior remained motionless, a statue carved from the twilight. The standoff lasted perhaps a minute, thick with unspoken tension. Then, abruptly, the riders' nerve broke. With muttered curses and backward glances, they wheeled their horses and retreated, kicking up dust in their haste, their earlier aggression completely deflated. Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched them disappear, then slowly raised her gaze back to the ridge. The warrior was still there, a solitary guardian against the deepening shadows. Who was he? Why had he intervened? Was he friend or foe? A tiny ember, not quite hope, but something less brittle than despair, sparked within her weary spirit. The valley held more secrets than just Blackwood's greed. The warrior became a recurring phantom on the edges of her perception. He never approached, never spoke. Sometimes she'd glimpse him on the western ridge at dawn, sometimes high on the northern bluffs as dusk settled. His presence was a constant, silent weight on the landscape. And crucially, the Blackwood harassment stopped cold. No more cut fences, no more stray cattle, no more menacing riders. It seemed the mere possibility of the warrior's intervention was enough deterrent. Martha existed in a strange, tense peace, watched over by this enigmatic sentinel whose purpose remained shrouded in mystery. She learned later his name was Chayton, Falcon. One rainy evening, seeking refuge from the gloom both outside and within, Martha finally opened a small, locked chest containing Thomas's personal effects, things she hadn't had the strength to face before. Inside, beneath folded shirts and worn tools, lay a small, soft leather pouch. She opened it carefully. Nestled among fishing lures and spare buttons were two objects. A single, perfectly preserved eagle feather tied with faded blue trade cloth, and another arrowhead. Obsidian, identical in its intricate carving and dark material to the one she had found in the dry creek bed. Her breath caught. A memory, fragmented and distant, surfaced. Thomas, years ago, returning late one night from checking traps upstream, drenched and exhausted but with a strange light in his eyes. He'd spoken of finding a young Lakota boy, barely adolescent, swept away by a sudden flash flood in Cottonwood Creek, miles north of their land. The boy had been terrified, lost from his hunting party. Thomas hadn't hesitated. He'd pulled the boy from the raging water, built a fire, shared his meager rations, and stayed with him through the cold night, until the boy's anxious father and kin tracked him down the next morning. Thomas had described the father's immense relief, the solemn gratitude, and he'd shown Martha the arrowhead the father had pressed into his hand, a symbol of a life dead acknowledged. Thomas had kept it carefully, respecting the weight of the gift. Suddenly, the pieces slammed into place with breathtaking clarity. The arrowhead by the creek, the identical one in Thomas's pouch, the silent warrior on the ridge. Chayton. He had to be the boy Thomas saved all those years ago. The life debt. In Lakota tradition, such an obligation was sacred, unbreakable, spanning years and distance. He wasn't just a random passerby. He was here because of Thomas. He was honoring that debt, watching over the wife of the man who had saved his life. But as relief washed over her, a darker, colder understanding followed close behind, chilling her to the marrow. She remembered Thomas's growing anxiety in the weeks leading up to his death. His low, tense arguments overheard with Blackwood about missing stock and dishonest counts. His troubled talk of finding something dangerous. Thomas, always meticulous, always honest to a fault. He hadn't just fallen from his horse on some treacherous trail. No, he must have found concrete proof of Blackwood's wrongdoing. Not just bullying smaller ranchers, but something bigger, more perilous, stealing cattle from the reservation lands further north. A federal crime, the kind that could bring marshals down on the valley, ruin Blackwood completely. Thomas must have confronted him, and Blackwood, desperate to protect his rotten empire, had silenced him permanently. The accident was murder. Chayton's presence took on a new, sharper meaning. He wasn't just passively guarding her out of obligation. He was likely investigating, observing, gathering his own proof against the man who had not only threatened the widow of his savior, but had likely murdered him as well. The silent falcon on the ridge wasn't just a protector. He was an avenger, patiently waiting for the opportune moment to strike. This was far bigger than her small plot of land. It was about justice for Thomas, about exposing the rot at the heart of the valley. And Chayton, the quiet warrior bound by honor, held the scales. The confrontation, when it came, wouldn't just be about survival. It would be about reckoning. Hyram Blackwood's patience, never his strong suit, had frayed beyond repair. This silent, watchful Lakota was an intolerable obstacle. Chayton's mere presence unnerved his men, halted his campaign against the widow Cartwright, and represented a challenge to his absolute control over the valley. Worse, the warrior's stillness felt like judgment. Blackwood's festering anger finally reached its boiling point. Enough was enough. He would end the stalemate, decisively and brutally. He summoned Gus and Caleb, along with a dozen of his most hardened ranch hands. Men who followed orders without question, their loyalty bought and paid for. Under the cold glare of the moon, torches were soaked in oil, rifles checked and loaded. "We're finishing this tonight," Blackwood ground out, his voice thick with suppressed fury. "Burn her out. Drive her off that land for good. Make an example. And if that damned Indian interferes," his eyes were chips of ice, "deal with him too. Permanently." The posse rode out, a dark knot of menace moving across the moonlit plains towards Martha's isolated cabin. The night air was unnaturally still, heavy with anticipation. Inside the cabin, a single lamp cast a warm, defiant glow. Martha stood near the window, the Winchester heavy in her hands. She had heard them coming, the faint drumming of hooves growing steadily louder. Fear coiled tight in her belly, cold and sharp, but beneath it lay a bedrock of resolve forged in hardship and loss. She would not run. This was her ground. But just as the riders approached the broken line of her fence, preparing to surge forward, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows cloaking the western ridge. Chayton, mounted on his pinto, he rode down the slope, not with the haste of fear, but with a slow, deliberate dignity that commanded attention. He carried no rifle. Instead, his feathered lance was held upright, its obsidian point seeming to gather the moonlight. He maneuvered his pony directly into the path of Blackwood's advancing men and planted the butt of the lance firmly into the dry, cracked earth. A silent, unyielding declaration. Blackwood's riders faltered, pulling up short, horses shifting nervously. Confusion and a superstitious unease rippled through their ranks. Who was this lone warrior who dared to stand against a dozen armed men? Blackwood, enraged by the audacity, spurred his horse forward, halting just yards from Chayton. "Get out of the way, Indian," he snarled, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "This is white man's business. It doesn't concern you." Chayton did not flinch. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, resonant, carrying the authority of the wind across the plains. "It concerns me, Hiram Blackwood." The use of the full name was deliberate, a direct challenge. "It concerns the honor of the Lakota people. The Lakota whose cattle you have been stealing for years, rebranding them, driving them south to sell as your own." A collective intake of breath from the riders. Stunned silence, then uneasy murmurs. Stealing from the reservation? That was federal territory. Dangerous business, far beyond harassing a widow. Blackwood's face mottled with shock and fury. Lies. Filthy lies. You have no proof. Proof. Chayton's gaze swept over the nervous men, then settled back on Blackwood, pinning him like an insect. I have the word of Lakota hunters, who tracked their stolen calves onto your range. I have the testimony of traders in Dodge City, who bought cattle with altered brands from your men, asking no questions. His voice remained calm, factual, each word landing like a stone. And I have the truth of how Thomas Cartwright died. He described the location of Thomas's accident, miles off any logical trail, in treacherous terrain Blackwood's men usually avoided. He spoke of the injury, not consistent with a simple fall, more like the result of a violent shove. He mentioned the tracks found near the site, tracks matching Blackwood's distinctive horseshoe prints. Prince Thomas himself had commented on seeing near stolen stock just days before his death. He spoke of Thomas finding a hidden ledger, detailing the illicit cattle sales. He found your secret book, didn't he, Blackwood? Chayton's voice dropped, becoming colder, sharper. The book that proved everything. He confronted you about it, threatened to expose you. So you took him to that ridge, and you pushed him. You murdered him to protect your stolen riches. Blackwood began to bluster, his face contorted, denying everything, calling Chayton a liar, a savage. It's his word against mine. Nobody will believe. But his denial rang hollow. Doubt was a visible contagion among his hired hands. They looked from Blackwood's increasingly desperate face to the implacable warrior, then towards the lamplit window where the widow stood watching. Hanging for murder or facing federal marshals over stolen Indian cattle wasn't part of their pay. One by one, then in pairs, men began subtly reining their horses back, disengaging, melting into the shadows. Gus and Caleb looked wildly at their father, their usual arrogance dissolving into raw fear. At that critical moment, more riders appeared, carrying lanterns that cut through the gloom. Sheriff Brody, looking grim but resolute, flanked by two townsmen he'd hastily deputized. Someone had ridden for help, perhaps Hemlock, perhaps another neighbor finally finding their courage. Brody rode into the tense circle of light, taking in the scene Blackwood, the warrior, the scattering gunman, the widow with her rifle. He had clearly overheard Chayton's final, damning accusations. Hiram, Brody said, his voice regaining a measure of authority long absent. These are grave charges. Murder. Theft of reservation stock. That's federal jurisdiction. Chayton inclined his head towards the sheriff. The proof of the cattle theft is documented. Ask him where Thomas Cartwright kept his private ledger, the one that vanished after his death. Cornered, sweating, his support dissolving around him, Hyram Blackwood seemed to shrink in his saddle. The fight went out of him, replaced by a terrified understanding of his doom. "Arrest him, Sheriff," Martha called out then, her voice ringing clear and strong across the clearing, steadying the Winchester in her hands. "Arrest them all. For what they did to Thomas. For everything." Seeing the balance irrevocably tipped, Sheriff Brody drew his service revolver. "Hiram Blackwood, Gus Blackwood, Caleb Blackwood, by the authority vested in me by this territory, you are under arrest. Suspicion of murder, cattle rustling." The remaining few hired hands spurred their horses and vanished into the night. Gus and Caleb submitted numbly as Brody's deputies disarmed them. Hiram Blackwood stared blankly ahead as the sheriff took his pistol, his empire built on fear and greed collapsing around him in the moonlight. Justice, unexpected and fierce, had finally been served. Martha lowered her rifle slowly, a profound wave of exhaustion and relief washing over her. Across the space, her eyes met Chayton's. He gave a single, solemn nod. The debt was honored, the balance restored. Music swells, theme becomes more hopeful, resolved. The arrest of the Blackwoods sent shockwaves through the valley. With Hiram and his sons facing territorial justice for murder and federal charges for the reservation cattle theft, charges solidified by evidence Chayton discreetly passed to the arriving marshals before melting back into the plains as silently as he'd appeared, their grip on Redemption Creek shattered. Neighbor helped neighbor dismantle the illegal dam, and the clear, cool water of Cottonwood Creek sang once more as it flowed onto Martha Cartwright's thirsty land. The town breathed easier. The oppressive weight of the Blackwood rain lifted. Fear slowly gave way to a cautious optimism. Stories of the silent Lakota warrior, Chayton, the Falcon, became legend, whispered around campfires, recounted in the saloon. A reminder that courage could bloom in desolate places, and justice sometimes wore buckskin and carried a lance. Martha rebuilt. Slowly, steadily, she coaxed life back into her soil, her spirit mending alongside her fences. The physical and emotional scars remained, reminders of the fire she had walked through, but they were marks of survival, not defeat. She worked her land with a quiet determination, her connection to it forged in struggle and sealed in resilience. The cabin stood firm, the garden thrived. Sometimes, particularly after a strong prairie wind had swept through, she would find a single, perfect hawk feather lying inexplicably on her porch step, a silent message across the distance. She remained a woman of few words, her eyes holding the wisdom of hard-won experience. But she was no longer just a grieving widow. She was Martha Cartwright, the woman who held her ground, who faced down greed and violence, and who, with the help of an honorable warrior repaying a sacred debt, had found her own hard-won peace beneath the vast, unblinking sky of the West. The dust had settled, but the story endured, a testament to the enduring power of courage in the heart of the wild frontier.